right? From all the, and so we can start.
5:30, so.
Yeah, we can start. Okay.
You said a few words about Institute?
Yeah. Lunchtime, I expect in the Institute.
Oh, lunchtime.
Yeah, yeah. No, they go in
They
over.
remember for lunch.
They go in over, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, let's walk in. You can see our,
You can say, if you want, a few
Sorry,
things about
I
Institute.
broke my finger, so I have to. Yeah.
I was down in the States over the weekend, and I brought back laryngitis with me. I was in Washington,
Yeah.
D.C. in Washington, D.C., where a lot of talking goes on. It was just exhausted my voice. But we're happy to have you here. You know what the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research is. We're not we're pro-Israel think tank. We are independent, we're not supported by the organized Jewish communities, supported by the state. We generate our own money, so we can in fact be independent in our capacities. And we exist in order to, in various ways, through publications, conferences, speeches, meetings, bring what we see as the truth about Israel to the public, Canadian, the American public, both Jewish and non-Jewish. It's very important to us to reach non-Jewish people in Canada. We also have a new institute in the U.S., in Washington, which is why I was down there in March. So we were 26 years old. We're very successful. We are known all over the world. We have 40,000 people who take our publications now. We have a daily email that some of you might like to get. It's free. You just sign up for it. Every day I give an issue of 2 or 3 outstanding articles by specialists to inform people. We hold conferences. We're holding a conference in Toronto next month on media coverage of Israel after the Gaza war. And my colleague, to my left, will be she's to my right. She's to my left. She will be participating in this major conference. A few words about Barbara. She is one of the outstanding commentators in Canada on contemporary cultural and political issues. She writes for the superb newspaper called the National Post, which many of us think is the best newspaper in Canada. She is a constant, intelligent presence and voice. She has an academic background. She's graduate work in English literature. She's taught in English literature. She's been a member of the Institute almost. We're delighted to have her here today, and we're privileged to have her here today. I was going to say a few words to situate the topic of the media in Israel. But my voice is running out. I wanted to say two things. One is there's nothing new about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred. It goes back to the ancient Greek. There was anti-Semitism before there was Christianity, Greco-Roman anti-Semitism. There was Christianity was the major source of anti-Semitism from the late classical period forward. Christianity grew out of Judaism and then grew away from Judaism. The founder of Christianity was a Jewish teacher named Yeshu or Joshua. But his followers moved away and developed a series of stereotypes, negative stereotypes for Jews. Jews were Christ killers. Jews had lost the covenant. The covenant had gone compared to Christianity, and so on. A Roman emperor named Constantine in the early 4th century, the Common Era, for his political reasons, converts to Christianity. Until that time, Christianity was a minor religion. Judaism was a much more powerful religion in the 4th century than Christianity. But the emperor wanted to use the nascent Christian church as an administrative apparatus. He converts. So Christianity in the 4th century, to use that awful word, empire, becomes the state religion of Rome. And the first thing the Christians set about doing is legislating against the Jews, excluding the Jews from the economy, excluding Jews from culture, putting the Jews in a subordinate position. And in the 5th century, a great Christian theologian comes along, a man named St. Augustine, who writes a very influential book called the Civitas Dei, the City of God. And he develops for the first time in the Christian world what is called a theology of the Jews, a systematic approach to the Jews. Who are the Jews? How do we relate to them? It's a very interesting moment in the history of Christian-Jewish relations. Augustine says something like this: when you look around yourself, you look around a city today in the West, 4th century, Jews, they are the lineal descendants of the people who killed Christ. We quite rightly put them under restrictions and constraints. However, we need the Jews. Why do we need the Jews? Because God didn't lie in the Bible. God made promises to mankind. He talked about messianic age. Jesus is the culmination of Judaic prophecy. Why do we need the Jews? Because we will know that Jesus is truly returning to earth, and not some devil or some antichrist, when the Jews convert. When the Jews convert, that means this is the real moment when Jesus has come back, the second coming. Now you might think that kind of odd. That theology of the Jews is what preserved us across the Middle Ages. Christianity destroyed many other religious movements. Think of the Cathars in Provence in the 12th century. Many others. Crusades, not against the Jews. The Jews had a place, although a subordinate place, albeit a subordinate place, in the Christian worldview. And that way, that preserved us. And the last point I want to make, I'm compressing very much. The only really new thing in anti-Semitism, in a long history of the oldest age, the only really new thing occurs from the 1860s and 70s in Europe, principally in Austria and Germany and France. The new thing is the application to the Jews of the scientific idea of race, scientific idea of language groups, language groups. The Semitic language group, for instance, was held by linguists to include Hebrew and Aramaic and various other groups. So the anti-Jewish forces in Europe in the 1880s, 70s, 80s, and particularly the 90s, they adopt a racial view of the Jew. This is a novum, we say. This is a new fact. The Jew is no longer a religious group, either to be tolerated or to be forced to convert. Think of the Spanish expulsion of the Jews. The Jews refused to convert, and they're under pressure. The Spaniards got rid of them, pushed them out. 1492. I remember once in Toledo, I went to a church that had been a synagogue, Casablanca. And the Spanish guards saw me there looking around, and he said, "You must be Jewish, only Jews come." And I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "Well, don't think too badly of us. We weren't Nazis." I know what he meant. We didn't kill you, we didn't exterminate you, we pushed you out. You suffered, but you survived. I said, "Gracias." Thank you so much. But the novum is very important, this new thing, because racial anti-Semitism meant that you could not terminate, you couldn't transform your status as a Jew by converting. You know, in Christianity, if you converted, more or less you were accepted into the Christian community, no longer. So it's the racial idea of the Jew. If a Jew assimilates, tries to be a German, tries to be a Frenchman, gives up his Judaism, her Judaism, that doesn't help anymore, because the nature of the Jew is in the blood. It's racial, we would say today genetic. And in fact, it's worse. The Jew is more threatening when he or she no longer looks and acts like a Jew, he looks like you and me. That's threatening because their genes, their blood will get into the larger Aryan group, as they call themselves, and bring us down. You think of the horrible treatise of Richard Wagner, the German composer. The music of the Jews. He wrote a book called The Jewish Music. The Jews are taking over European music. They're corrupting us. We have to expel the Jews from opera, from constant, we have to have an already in music. That's the problem with music as well. It's an attempt to displace and answer what he saw as Jewish music, Jews like Bizet. We have it today, by the way. It's an odd kind of thing. We have Klinghoffer, the opera in New York. It's a revival of Wagnerian notions of the Jews in opera, right? Where the Palestinians who murdered this poor wheelchair-bound Jewish guy, an American, threw him off the Achille Laura into the ocean. They're the heroes of the opera. They're taken seriously. And the opera is at the Met. And I've done everything. I'm a New Yorker, that's where I come from. I grew up in the Met. I had a cousin, second cousin, who was she was in the chorus. I went to every Metropolitan Opera when I was a kid. To see that Jewish opera, all Jews built that opera house. And director Peter Lang is a Jew. Putting on this piece of garbage, excuse me, is really very upsetting. Yeah. So, how did we survive? Well, partially until racial anti-Semitism, we survived through St. Augustine. We were the miner's canary, for Christianity. The Welsh, they went down into the mines and they took a canary with them in a cage. You know why they did that? Why would you take a canary down into the mines with you? They know how to find their way out. Not exactly. When you go deep in the earth and you seam the mine coal, you get toxic fumes. So when the canary keeled over in the cage, miners knew they had to get the hell out of there. So we were the miner's canary of Christianity. Racial anti-Semitism removed that ground, and there is a direct line between racial anti-Semitism of the 1880s and the advent of the Nazis after World War I. The Nazi program, which was a novum, exterminate the Jews entirely, and not just the Jews of Germany, not just the Jews of Eastern and Western Europe, but the Jews of the world. The Nazis, had they won, had they defeated the Russians, they would have turned on Great Britain and finally destroyed the British. The next plan, we know all this, the next plan was to expand to America and to do away with the Jews. And by the way, when they had finally exterminated all the Jews of the world, they would exterminate all the Christians. Because in their twisted view of things, Christianity is the bastard daughter of Judaism. They understood the relationship. So, how did we survive? Well, we survived until the Holocaust. The Holocaust took a great toll. But the Western nations finally defeated Adolf Hitler with the help of the Russians. And we founded the United Nations, 1946-47, 1947, the Universal Declaration of Rights, predicated on the Holocaust. There shall never again be the extermination of groups of people. The civilized world commits itself to prevent this kind of thing ever happening again. Did it succeed? Unfortunately not. Where are we today? I'll leave that alone. One last thing. A very great literary critic, George Steiner, has his own theory of why the Jews survived. Every other people in the ancient world that was defeated, dispersed, had its temple destroyed, his leadership sent into a diaspora, scattering, disappeared. Eventually, even the Romans disappeared as the barbarians invaded in the 5th and 6th century. The Jews didn't disappear. We're here. We're here. Steiner said that's because the Jews, unlike any other people, have a portable homeland. We do have a portable homeland. If we are evicted, defeated temporarily from our homeland in Eretz Yisrael, we also have the Torah, we have Tanakh. It holds us together in the long period of night until we return. And we return. It's a great miracle. I'm going to see you again because you'll be coming to Liberal Arts College at Concordia, a few blocks from here, on Thursday. I tell my students it is a great miracle. Miracles still happen. One of the great miracles is the survival of the Jewish people, and then the thriving of the Jewish people, the reestablishment of the state, and the thriving of the Jewish people. And we will be, I'm going to end now.
We'll be worried for them, they have to get to the IMAX by you.
Oh, okay. Lastly, we are holding we have an annual gala that raises money for the Institute, and Israel's high-tech miracle, Israel's high-tech miracle, the Jewish gift to mankind, because that's what it is. Israel is a gift to mankind. And it's a miraculous reality. And we have some of the leading Israelis in agriculture, water technology, electronics, defense, military, you name it, coming. We have Canadians coming. We hope to get Stephen Harper, the pro-Israel leader of Canada, the most pro-Israel political leader in the world today. He's here in Canada. We know him well. We're hoping that he will come to speak. And we're hoping that Bibi Netanyahu will also be coming to speak. And a great day-long gala we're going to be holding in Okay, so thank you very much. And I'll give you over to the 10th
I'm sorry, I didn't know that this was going to be set up and I'd be talking to a bunch of young people from Israel. I would have tried to make it a little more informal, less of a lecture format, but here I am with a lot to say and not that much time, and it is a lecture, so I'm sorry about that. But at least I'll begin with a joke. Even though media bias against Israel is not funny, but Jews do have a habit of turning dark subjects into dark humor. So I'll begin with a joke that probably if you lived here you already would have heard. A man is walking down the street in Paris when he sees a vicious pit bull attacking a little girl. That's another one of my topics, pit bulls. He kills the dog and saves the child's life. Afterward, he is swarmed by reporters who say, "Tell us your name. Your fellow Parisians will love you when they see tomorrow's headlines. Hero saves girl from vicious dog." He says, "But I'm not from Paris," the man says. "Well, that's okay," says the journalist. "All France will love you when they see the headlines, hero saves girl from vicious dog." But he says, "I'm not from France." "Oh, never mind. All of Europe will love you when they see tomorrow's headlines, hero saves girl from vicious dog." He says, "I'm not from Europe at all." So they say, "Well, where are you from?" He says, "I'm from Israel." The next day's headlines read, "Israeli kills little girl's dog." It's not so far off the mark, is it? Okay, so we know that media bias against Israel exists. It's no longer a hypothesis to be proved. No reasonable observer can fail to conceive that the media are disproportionately obsessed with Israel, or that Israel is held to a higher moral standard than other nations in its behavior toward its avowed enemies. There is a bias spectrum, but on the extreme end, the viciousness can be astonishing, even in normally respectable publications. We have an organization called Honest Reporting, and they're wonderful for monitoring the media. And they bring us news, and they also bring us examples that are quite shocking. For example, a Sky News reporter compared the strikes on Gaza this summer, in which the civilian dead numbered in the hundreds, to the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima. Time magazine is really, the standard. I mean, it's not as big as it used to be, but it is the establishment magazine. Claims Israeli soldiers killed Palestinians who steal their internal organs, a blood libel of the most vile and brazen kind. The New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief claims that stories of Hamas intimidation of journalists are nonsense, even though other New York Times reporters have documented many examples of it. Cartoonists routinely depict Israel as Nazis with imagery that consciously resurrects a long history of Christian blood libels, the obscenities of Nazi-era Der Stürmer graphics, and the more recent big lie of Holocaust inversion with Palestinians as the new Anne Frank and Israel as Hitler. Israel has fought many wars, some against massed forces in which Israel was clearly the underdog, like the Six-Day War, have been absolutely necessary and supported both by Israelis and by the world. Others have involved Israel in conflicts with the cause of the war less well defined and the Israeli government clumsier in its communications with the outside world than it should have been, producing bias that can't always be waved away as reflexive hatred of Israel. Operation Protective Edge provides a good background for analysis of media bias because The casus belli, the cause of the war, is so unambiguous. This was a war of necessity. The unprovoked, indiscriminately aimed, and pan-Israel rocket attacks from Hamas, which terrorized all Israelis for weeks on end, and even briefly threatened to bring Israel's economy to a standstill with a rocket so close to Ben Gurion Airport that it produced panicky flight boycotts amongst airline companies, absolutely demanded a very firm response. The discovery of the vast Gaza tunnels complex, whose stark implications for human tragedy and national disaster sobered even the most ardent Palestinian sympathizers, foreign and domestic. Iconic Israeli writer Amos Oz, normally sympathetic to Palestinian grievances, summed up the general mood in Israel in an interview with an anti-Israel Deutsche Welle journalist, with Oz quite aggressively preempting questions with his own interrogation, asking the interviewer, "What would you do if your neighbor across the street sits down on the balcony, puts his little boy in his lap, and starts shooting machine gun fire into your nursery? What would you do if your neighbor across the street digs a tunnel from his nursery to your nursery in order to blow up your home or in order to kidnap your family?" Widespread anti-Israel media bias is a charge that anti-Zionists tend to wave away as a conspiracy theory. But because this summer's war was so indisputably necessary, and because Israel's response to Hamas's aggressions were indisputably proportionate, according to any objective standards, and in comparison to other just wars, the accusation has become untenable for any self-respecting observer. The moral clarity around this war has also inspired several brilliant and detailed proofs of media bias, which, taken together, amount to a damning indictment of the mainstream media. Especially notable in this line is the meticulously detailed, long analysis of New York Times bias against Israel by investigative reporter Richard Bahar in the August 21st issue of Forbes magazine. It's very damning. The New York Times' most important reporter in Gaza for the past few years has used Yasser Arafat as his profile photo on Facebook. Abir Ayoub, a Palestinian resident of Gaza and a former Times reporter until 2013, was himself boycotting all Israeli products and posting hostile comments to Facebook. Bahar's printed-out report is 42 pages long. No honest skeptic can read it and deny extreme bias pervades not just the New York Times, but also the entire mainstream media, with the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, the most shamefully brazen of the pack. They really are the worst of the worst. Bahar does have words of praise for the media of other countries, including Canada, citing the Globe and Mails, that's our National Post and Globe and Mail are the two national papers, citing their reporter, Patrick Martin, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Derek Stoffel for candor regarding Hamas's use of human shields, as well as the firing of rockets from schools, demonstrable facts ignored by many media. He also cites the oft-quoted 2009 testimony before the UN regarding Operation Cast Lead of British officer Colonel Richard Kemp, a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, who said the Israel Defense Forces did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in the combat zones than any army in the history of warfare. Matty Friedman, for another outstanding example, a journalist and an author who worked as a reporter and editor in the Jerusalem Bureau of Associated Press between 2006 and 11, wrote an article for a recent edition of an online magazine called tabletmag.com, don't know if you know it, it's very good, entitled An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. The article, which has been widely distributed, explains how and why so many media covering the Middle East are essentially telling their audiences that Jews are, quote, the worst people on earth. All the themes that he adduces, double standards, failure to acknowledge Hamas intimidation of journalists, reliance on uncorroborated facts, so-called, provided by Hamas, Hamas censorship versus Israeli openness. They're all replicated in other critiques like Bahar's and others. Friedman begins by noting, as representative, a recent New Yorker article summing up world events over the summer. The article assigned one sentence each to the horrors of Nigeria and Ukraine, 4 sentences to the abominations of ISIS, you know what's going on. And the rest, 30 sentences to Israel and Gaza. But Friedman is not interested in bashing the New Yorker or any other publication. He has a bigger story to tell, and story is the key word because the Central Israel narrative shows very little variation in all the mainstream media. To measure how important a story is to a news organization, Friedman writes, look at the staffing. During his tenure at Associated Press, which is no different from the other large bureaus, there were 40 staffers covering Israel and Palestinian territories, more than in China, Russia, India, Arab Spring countries, and all 50 sub-Saharan African countries combined. Exactly one news person covered Syria before the Syrian civil war, even though more lives have been lost in Syrian violence in the last 3 years than in Israel-Arab conflicts for the whole last century. There were 1,500 journalists in Israel this summer. How many were covering Pakistan's war against North Waziristan terrorists in the same time period? You probably never even heard about it, with equivalent civilian deaths and a displacement of 500,000 refugees, probably fewer than 5. Friedman tells us that Associated Press staffers quickly learned the rules governing what got published. Corruption in the Palestinian Authority, which Friedman wanted to cover, the bureau chief told him that was, quote, not the story. But Israeli corruption, that was covered thoroughly. During one 7-week period in November and December of 2011, Friedman tallied 27 articles about the various moral, political, cultural, and social failings of Israeli society, more than all the stories critical of Palestinian society published in the previous 3 years. The Hamas charter, which calls for Israel's destruction, was never mentioned in print all the time Friedman worked for Associated Press. When Israel imposed censorship, staffers could mention that. They were allowed to mention that, but not when Hamas imposed censorship. That is because, Friedman writes, Associated Press feared Hamas intimidation and acted accordingly. Friedman writes that as an editor on the AP news desk, because of a threat to a reporter, I personally erased a key detail, that Hamas fighters were dressed as civilians and were being counted as civilians in the death toll. Most reporters in Gaza, he says, quote, believe their job is to document violence directed by Israel at Palestinian civilians. That is the essence of the Israel story. The few journalists who documented Hamas rocket launches this summer were not large bureau staffers, but mostly, quote, scrappy, peripheral, and newly arrived players. A Finnish guy, an Indian crew, a few others. These poor souls didn't get the memo. Friedman wants us to understand the more important story most media shrink from covering. The narrative is usually framed as a David and Goliath story in which the Palestinians are the little David with a slingshot and Israel is Goliath, which is the way, reversed, Israel was once perceived vis-a-vis the entire Arab world. The real conflict, though, is Jewish-Arab, or even Jewish-Muslim. 6 million versus a billion, and Israel is the David. And it began long before Israel was a state. Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, the Taliban, they're all one. In Friedman's metaphor, Israel is just a small village on the slope of a volcano, and the lava pouring down is radical Islam. Israel's sins are pikayun, they're nothing compared to those of Islamists, but confronting reality is hard. Many in the West, Friedman says, prefer, quote, the old comfort of parsing the moral failures of Jews and the feeling of superiority that this brings them. For the bigger picture on how we got to this pass, it is worth revisiting American-Israeli press war veteran Zev Chaffetz. 1985 book, Double Vision, How the Press Distorts America's View of the Middle East. Chaffetz was the press officer for the Israeli government, and he liaised between the government and the international press, so he had a close-up and intimate view of what went on in a macro and a micro way. He explains how media bias against Israel became entrenched and identifies the themes that keep cropping up in all the critiques we read today. One major theme, or a few major themes, are those of bannings, news blackouts, and physical intimidation. The Western press do not complain about being shut out by Arab states, even though they complained bitterly, for example, when the U.S. imposed a ban on reportage in Grenada during the first few days of its 1983 invasion. Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq were dubbed the Ark of Silence by Chaffetz in 1985 because they prohibited foreign correspondents from living on their territories. They still forbid it, and who would want to live there even if they didn't? Even back then, the Assad government was murdering Lebanese, American, and German journalists, killings that were covered up in the American press. Ironically, the murderers of Islamic State today aren't allowing for any cover-ups. Their gruesome public beheadings ensure their murders are well covered. Chaffetz makes an interesting point about what follows when reporters are not allowed to be with the action on the spot as it happens. Since a media vacuum needs to be filled, what happens is you find lounge chair academic experts expostulating on TV and in op-eds in the newspapers. This long-distance analysis syndrome lulls people into thinking they understand what is going on, but in fact, these so-called experts often make enormous errors, which is why the entire Middle East, apart from Israel, is a mess, and why U.S. policy has been stupidly fixated on the Palestinian question as the key to peace and stability in the region. While the Arab world is virtually closed to the media, Israel is conversely absurdly open. Hundreds of reporters camp out in comfortable Israel. With its contentious society, a free press, much of which is sharply critical of Israel and Zionism, intellectual elites who lean heavily to the left and are well connected internationally, these foreign reporters think they are tapping into the heart of Israeli opinion and character, when in fact they're getting a very skewed version of both. Language plays a huge part. Israeli political and intellectual elites speak English and talk to media people with candor, but none of these same media people speak any Middle Eastern languages. They are therefore heavily dependent on translators and fixers to facilitate their information gathering on the Arab side of the story. Dealing with the Israeli army or government press officer is frequently cumbersome and annoying, but fixers are informal and personal. There are no rules and regulations. Friendships spring up. The reporter may be taken to the fixer's home, treated graciously, meet his friends who tell their sad stories. He doesn't meet Israelis who have suffered from terrorism in the same informal way, though. If they did, maybe he'd hear some equally sad stories to at least balance the emotional element. Media people's fixers often give them a laundered version of what's being said in Arabic, which they naively accept without further interrogation. Not that much further interrogation is possible under the circumstances, and yet they do not make that clear in their reportage. They often do not say in their reports what they are professionally bound to say. This information could not be corroborated by independent sources, which is what they say about other things. Information given out on the Arab side is so unreliable that on their own internal affairs, Palestinians often prefer intelligence from Israel. In one ludicrous story, which was entirely unreported, a Haaretz reporter detailed a planned coup by Hamas on Fatah leader Mahmoud Abbas, which was discovered by Shin Bet in early August and passed on to Abbas. When scolded by Hamas leader Khaled Mashal for accepting Israel information rather than his own denials, Abbas replied, "I believe Israel's reports." Polls in Israel had 95% of Israelis supporting the war. In the U.S., 42%. Of the 42%, support was highest in older demographics. Only 25% of those under 30 years old supported the war, though, and that is extremely worrying. Amongst others, two factors help to explain the disparity. Left-wing, harshly anti-Zionist domination of university discourse and politics, and the often intellectually irresponsible blogosphere, to which younger people pay disproportionate attention. One sees a great deal more passion and unrestrained language on blogs than one does in the mainstream press. As a result, many young people are exposed to a double whammy of anti-Israel rhetoric, and since, unlike our generation, they have grown up in a world in which anti-Semitism is the norm in many parts of the world, they consider outrageous accusations against Israel, Israel's treatment of Palestinians is like the Nazi treatment of Jews. Israel is an apartheid nation. Israel has no right to exist. They see these accusations as valid and a reflection of historical norms. As Jerusalem's Shalem College president Martin Kramer says, one finds in universities, quote, habituation to a language of loathing. Liberals are, of course, also hampered in their ability to speak honestly by their deeply internalized fidelity to the tenets of multiculturalism, according to which pundits must be reflexively labeled racist or Islamophobic for critiquing Islam-rooted anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and Israelis must assume their share of automatic guilt for their, quote, white privilege. Chaffetz ascribed the growing sympathy for the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, amongst leftists to the activism vacuum created by the end of the Vietnam War, essentially the need for a new, non-Western underdog. Palestinian self-determination became the righteous cause of the left, and carrying the heavy water for that cause has from the beginning, ironically enough, been the special task of left-wing Jews. Intellectual leadership on the left is heavily dominated by Jews who have made progressivism their religion and opposition to Israel a proof of their political correctness. In Israel, progressivism shaped the new historians of the 1980s who promoted the theory that Israel and Zionism were born in sin. Their books became weapons in the hands of Western intellectuals and journalists to show that Israel was anti-progressive, and they helped to turn many influential, once very pro-Israel Protestant Christian denominations against Israel and supportive of the boycott movement. No other national, religious, or ethnic collective in the history of mankind has ever produced such a numerous and influential constituency of their own, who have made it their life's ambition not only to demonize the defining aspirations of their own people, but to subvert the very conditions that make for their own people's security in a volatile, hate-ridden world, most of it directed squarely at Jews. These Jews know what they are doing. They would not be doing it unless they felt a profound conviction that they had a moral obligation to speak truth to power. They do regard themselves as morally superior to Zionist Jews, and they do feel they are the true heirs to the prophetic tradition, which is why it is a misnomer to call them self-hating Jews, as many people do. They are self-loving, or rather self-infatuated Jews. If they merely believed Israel was in the wrong, they would argue that, as objective news analysts. That they choose to put their own Jewish credentials front and center speaks to their self-image as martyrs, suffering for Judaism's greater good as they perceive it. Narcissism is a powerful political aphrodisiac. It also helps to explain why no other political issue is argued so emotionally on the page. What is the average person to think when he listens to Jews who specifically invoke their Jewishness to explain their hostility to Israel? What is the average media person stationed in Israel to think when many of the very people he mingles most frequently with are hostile ideologues, if anything, more contemptuous of Zionism than their European and American peers? Or when he is exposed to a barrage of Netanyahu bashing that makes Bush derangement syndrome pale in comparison? Haaretz in particular has made Netanyahu bashing almost a full-time occupation, offering pop psychology and analysis of the prime minister, his wife, and even his children. Well, that such a person would naturally accept their opinion as authoritative. On the other hand, Israel is not blameless in allowing so much media bias to metastasize with so little strategic and systematic rebuttal. Threads of both arrogance and incompetence run through Israel's communications history. In his 2004 book, Still Life with Bombers, Israel in the Age of Terrorism, David Horowitz, editor of the Jerusalem Report, tackled Israel's public relations failure with brutal frankness. He writes, "From the very start of this conflict, the Israeli spokespeople and their various hierarchies have been criminally, even murderously, incompetent. And I use those terms with full awareness of their weight." Horowitz provided ample evidence of the general anti-Israel bias in the international media, with emphasis on such big lie catastrophes as the bogus Jenin massacre. Then he identified in painful detail what Israel did wrong in response to the lies. The basic problem at the highest political levels, he concluded, was arrogant indifference to the amateurism in its public relations core. For example, former Foreign Minister Shimon Peres dismantled much of the ministry's information hierarchy during the early 1990s. According to Horowitz's summary of the government's view, quote, Israel didn't need to worry about public relations because it was so clearly doing the right thing. Spokespersons brought before the Western media are often patronage choices and frequently speak poor English, even though Israel boasts any number of competent, fluently bilingual experts in communications. As one example, Horowitz cited an underqualified woman with very poor English, selected through an affirmative action initiative to promote female diplomats, as Israel's spokesperson in London. She performed disastrously, but Israel ignored passionate pleas from the Anglo-Jewish community to replace her. In Jenin, for instance, Israel banned reporters for days. At the very least, an army spokesman's unit should have been sent into Jenin and provided journalists with footage to neutralize the inflammatory massacre allegations. You remember the Al-Jura hoax? Well, I don't have to explain that.
Yeah.
The Al-Jura hoax traveled around the world several times without Israel doing much of anything to rebut it. It was left to Frenchman Philippe Carcente, an indefatigable myth-buster, to pursue the Al-Jura hoax as his life's mission, and he has not gotten wholehearted thanks from Israel for doing so. The root of all this amateurism, Horowitz says, begins in the Prime Minister's office. Ehud Barak was badly served by advisors for whom public relations should have been a priority, but wasn't, while Sharon was caught up in a siege mentality, believing everyone except the United States was so disposed to hate him that no amount of effective communications would do any good. His often incompetent spokespeople's failures reinforced his defeatist perception. As for Menachem Begin, Chaffetz takes him rather sharply to task in his book. The 1982 war in Lebanon was the first Israeli war fought without a domestic consensus, which meant media criticism from outside Israel was matched by criticism from within. That particular war aroused a media frenzy like few other conflicts in living memory. Cover stories in Time and Newsweek, endless articles, books, film documentaries, they poured forth. Lebanon's own civil war in 1975 and 6 had not received a fraction of that attention. Also, for the first time in Israel's war history, there were TV cameras. Vietnam had been televised, but only on one side. In Lebanon, both sides were filmed. The result was devastatingly bad press for Israel. Israel made mistakes. Not allowing foreign correspondents near the battles in the first 5 days gave reporters an excuse for their grossly exaggerated accounts of destruction in Tyre and Sidon, and continued even after media people were able to see it. It was also a mistake to allow American TV to send reports from Beirut via Israel's satellite facilities after the Beirut transmitter broke down. Basically, it gave Yasser Arafat a platform to propagandize from. No nation is obligated to provide media facilities for its enemy. The failure to explain the whys and wherefores of the bombing campaign was Israel's gravest self-inflicted wound. Any nation shelling foreign cities day after day without explanation can expect negative reviews, as Hamas learned this summer when even a press that wanted to be sympathetic to Gaza did express grudging sympathy for Israel when no good reason for Gaza's unrelenting rocket attacks was forthcoming. Worst of all, in Lebanon, Begin was missing in action, communications-wise. His cabinet ministers were weak at the job of public relations. Contradictory casualty figures were presented by the minister in charge of the Lebanese refugee problem, which damaged Israel's credibility, while then Defense Minister Ariel Sharon's reputation plummeted. Chaffetz explains that Begin's silence, quote, was largely a function of his frustrated conviction that the press was hostile and that no matter what explanations he offered, it would continue to be. He had begun his tenure believing he could win the media around in a way that Labour had failed to do. 5 years later, he had become cynical and chose to ignore it. Add to all that the fact that the war was widely opposed in Israel as the war aims expanded beyond driving the PLO, out of artillery range of the Galilee, with critics volubly denouncing the campaign in the press and the conditions massed into a perfect storm of receptivity for media bias and a perfect vacuum where persuasive communications should have been. Meanwhile, the Palestinian spokespeople throughout the decades, usually articulate academics with long experience in schmoozily urbane media performance, have always remained on message. While democratic Israelis confuse observers with their open public dissension in a clashing disharmony of extremist views from left and right, the Palestinians speak softly and respectfully in excellent English with one unified anti-Israel voice. They sidestep unpleasant questions and they often lie. All we want is peace, they say. But they always appear reasonable. Ignoring pointed, irrefutable evidence of their lies, they simply plow brazenly ahead with their narrative, assuming that readers and viewers will respond favorably to their aplomb and conviction and forget the rational challenge to their facts. As a columnist with one of our North American, the National Review, one of our conservative magazines here, tweeted on a few days ago, if it weren't for rockets, sanctimony would be the #1 Palestinian export. They have been quite successful under this assumption. Their narrative of a people that has always been there and has been displaced is simplistic and easy to grasp. The Zionist narrative, a long, convoluted account of wanderings and changing identities, political negotiations and treaties, legal texts and ancient documents, not so easy to grasp. What do most reporters know of the 1948 War of Independence, the British Mandate, the Balfour Declaration, or of Dreyfus and Herzl? Reporters are not very good on what came before or the larger meaning of events. The Zionist narrative is associated with the sufferings of the dead and the past. It can't compete with the sufferings of the present and the living. In his address to the 7th Annual Herzliya Conference in 2007, Richard Landes reminds us of the frailty of our Western civilization by recalling that in the 5th century, a culturally superior Roman civilization fell to a primitive tribal Germanic culture. It can happen again. The global jihad has escalated since 2007 and will continue to get worse before it gets better. The Palestinian narrative is fuel for the forest fire it resembles. Concluding, I cannot improve on Landes' advice to stakeholders. To Israel, he says, open a mouth, go on the offensive, challenge the fakes, the pervasive staging, and demand that the media do their own reviews before rushing, breathless, before they're public with the latest issue of Israeli sins. Remind them of how often and how destructively they have been wrong. Hold journalists who work here to their own professional standards. Feed information to the blogosphere, not to the mainstream media, and spend more money. Hezbollah alone outspends you threefold in Hasbara. To the diaspora, he says, stop being embarrassed by the media-driven image that you get of Israel. To Jewish leaders, he says, stop the ego battles, the hostility to new voices. We cannot afford to play by the old rules. To Europeans, get over the politics of resentment, rediscover the Atlantic Alliance, start addressing the problem of Islamic theocracy, awaken, and to especially younger journalists, break out of the pack, and above all, blow the whistle, break the shameful silence that has made of your fourth estate a rogue power. The mainstream media are the eyes and ears of modern civil society. If our eyes and ears are misinformed, we will not survive. Thank you for your patience. I actually had a whole other piece, but I think you want more time for discussion.
I'm sure people have
other things to do.
questions, observations. Feel free, please.
The question is kind of off topic, so I'm a bit done. There is a current Islamization in Europe now, and we don't see any media coverage, even though the local population in Europe is quite attacked by this. It's quite bad for them, this Islamization period. How how do you explain this? All this dealing with Israel alone, and they don't look at a general line of radical Islamization worldwide.
Well, my own feeling is it's the huge success of multiculturalism, which is the reigning ideology in Western nations, which makes you automatically Islamophobic if you mention that Islamism is happening and it's going to take over Europe. There are a few people that do talk about it, but it's considered. I know myself in my own newspaper, which is very mainstream. You have to walk extremely delicately. They will sue the Muslim organizations in Canada and the United States. You have to be so careful what you say. They will threaten to sue at the drop of a hat, and they have threatened to sue. And you know what? Mainstream media people, they really don't want the aggravation of being on the attack. They try to slip in. They try to be very, it's discreet. I mean, there's people do talk about it, but they talk about it in kind of very, how would you say, like, yeah, very eggshell and covert, and also in a kind of lofty, academic kind of a way. But nobody's running around screaming, fire, 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 like your house is on fire, which they should be. You have guys like Mark Stein, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, who says it straight out. As a result, he got dropped by several newspapers, very difficult.
So there's like a hush
It's
going around.
like a bit of a taboo. There's a taboo because people are afraid of being called racist.
I think there's a problem with the Europeans because that you have a post-colonial mentality, right? You see the Arabs as victims, and therefore they are to be treated differently. And secondly, there is also at work, I think, in Europe is very real. Holocaust guilt. Holocaust guilt gets turned inside out, turns into anti-Israelism. If it can be shown or claimed that Israel does terrible things to the Palestinians, then Europe is somehow or other free of
Cleansed out of the horrors of the Holocaust.
Of the horrors of the Holocaust. And these two things come together in interesting ways in Europe. I say one thing, North America is not Europe. Much of what much of our criticism has to do with European issues, media issues, campus issues, quite rightly. But if you look at opinion polls in America and Canada, the support for Israel is at its height. I always find it incredible, despite everything we're concerned with. The ordinary American or Canadian voter outside of Quebec is very pro-Israel. In the course of the Gaza war, it went from 74%, despite all of it. It's quite striking. The other thing I would say is that there is a terrible debate going on about religion in our society. Modern liberalism, secular liberalism, is anti-religious, and it's in the religious sectors of the society frequently that you have the most positive vision of the Jews and of Israel's situation in the world. It's no accident that it's American fundamentalist Protestants who are pro-Israel.
It's turning.
And now it's turning because the bad guys are focusing on it. They want to undercut this whole issue of delegitimation. Why are we concerned with delegitimation, particularly on campus, but also in the United Nations? What is delegitimation? Well, it's negative analysis of Israel. It's presenting Israel in the worst light, but it's much more than that. The analogy to apartheid in South Africa, that's the key analogy which you find on Canadian American campuses, the BDS movement, Israeli apartheid week is called. The left-wing students, Arab students, have demonstrations against Israel and so on. You delegitimate a state. When you delegitimate a state, you say it has no justification to exist. And the prelude to that, why do you do that? should all be very clear. The function of delegitimation is to prepare the way for the destruction of Israel. It is to justify the actual, somehow or other, justification of Israel from some cataclysmic event or whatever. That is the thrust. It's genocide. And I feel that we should be making that point on campuses clearly and repeatedly at every opportunity. This movement on campus is genocidal, vicious, violates the United Nations Charter of Rights, violates the American Constitution, violates the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. On the other hand, off the campuses are strange places. What goes on the campus is not characteristic of what goes on in the larger society, thank goodness. And what goes on in the larger society is generally pro-Israel. Will it remain like that? Will it always be like that? No, and therefore there must be eternal vigilance. It should be remembered.
But still, all these young people graduating from university, they virtually never heard another side. So still, you know, they're going out into the world with a very weak appreciation of the fact that there is another side, and they're not seeking another side. And I know, I mean, in my own family, I have a niece, you know, who's like this total leftist, and she kept from her university like that vision, and you can't at that time, you know, they're marinated in it, and facts, it's very hard to change the minds of people that have been indoctrinated, and this is what it is. These are propaganda baths, 4 years of university and just battered by propaganda. I don't see anything good coming out of the universities for quite a long time, and that's a serious problem, very serious problem.
I have some positive things to say about that.
Yes, please, something positive.
No, seriously, okay. So I've been, for an article that I was writing, I did some research on Pew Research statistics. Apparently, in the 1960s, so 1969, you know, when I think a lot of people in this room were our age, for example, they supported Israel at the same rates that young people our age right now are supporting Israel. So, in fact, it's not so much that the same
Everybody
people are
supported
getting older.
Israel then, though.
No, actually that's not true.
Until
because
1967.
The Vietnam War. There was a lot of post-Vietnam, so like the people that grew up in the late 60s and early 70s onward, these people were subject to a lot of anti-war, propaganda, protest, however you call it. And these people adapted an anti-Israel stance, and
Yes, after
to,
1967,
yeah,
right, yeah.
according to Pew, yeah, because the first poll was in 1969.
Yeah.
So in 1969, the college-age students, or people, basically had 25% support for Israel, maybe, and like 50% didn't care, and 25% were against, okay, or something like that. And the older generation at the time, you know, was almost unanimously pro-Israel. If you fast forward 40 years, let's say 2009, you end up with similar statistics. So these young people that were in the younger, so the older people that were in the younger demographic in 1969 are now almost unanimously supporting Israel again. So it's something that apparently it's not so much something that you can get and that it stays that way, but it's something that as you mature, you start to realize the truth. And you start to learn the truth, because it's almost inevitable that as you get older, the truth starts to, you know, uncover. You get a lot of exposure to all kinds of sources and can figure out for yourself. So I think that's a positive, but you can't guarantee it.
Thanks for that.
How can we guarantee that in the United States and Canada will always be pro-Israeli? I mean, all the next leaders are now in the campus that hates Israel and have a lot of pro-Palestine events.
Well, actually, it's a very good question, and we can't. I often say to people, we better enjoy Prime Minister Stephen Harper, because he's almost for sure going to be the very last Prime Minister of Canada to be so openly pro-Israel, because our Muslim population is now, what, 800,000?
600
We have thousands and thousands of immigrants coming in every year from South Asia, and our Islamic population is going to grow and grow and grow and grow, but our Jewish population is pretty stagnant because we're just barely replacing ourselves. So for votes. He's probably going to be the last, but that doesn't mean that the country will turn, as a whole, will turn against Israel. I'm just saying, up until Harper, no prime minister was pro-Israel. They were neutral. He's been the first one that's actively said, Israel is right, the others are wrong, and that's it. Like, I support Israel, and has gone to Israel and has made it clear. That's unusual for Canada. Canada likes to be the honest broker, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand, you know, like Switzerland in the war, oh, the Nazis on the one hand, the Allies on the other. I mean, you can't be neutral in this war, but they tried, you know, Canada has always tried to be. The United States, I can't see United States ever, well, ever, you never know, but it just seems impossible to me that it would ever be anti-Israel. It might not be as, very hard for me to, I think Americans identify very strongly with Israel.
Because the Jews are in the front in every position.
It's not only that. I think they identify as, they were like the New Jerusalem. You know, they saw that they saw that when they started their country, they saw themselves as like pioneers, like Zionists, coming to start a new land with a new idea. They had a new idea, you know, pluralism and people coming from all over, and that basic feeling has never wavered. And also, America is hated by the same people that hate Israel. They see Israel's enemies hate America every bit as much as they hate Israel. So,
Big Satan.
yeah, the big Satan and the little Satan. So there's going to be that bond. You know, when you're hated together. I don't see that but yeah, the enemy. But in any case, I think that there's a true bond there that is very, very strong. I don't think it's going to, in spite of Obama.
If you look at American education, in the colonial period, America develops, 17th century. Yale, Columbia, Harvard, you went to those colleges, and you learned 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin.
Very
If you look
strong.
at the seal of the American Ivy League, you'll find Hebrew usually from Yirmiyahu on the seal. So there's a very deep connection to Israel. Again, America is not Europe. It's important to understand that. There's dynamism there. It is not a society bound by class, right? It takes populist democracy seriously, and so on.
And it does not have populations of resentful former colonies. I mean, you know, France, Belgium, they had these populations sitting amongst them that resent the years that they were colonies, and they feel that they're owed, and they're very disaffected, and they also live, you know, in these enclaves all by themselves, and it fosters a kind of radicalism.
America has no massive socialist party, no communist party, let alone socialist party as the Europeans have, no Labor Party either. You have left-wing liberals, yes, usually Democrats, but you don't have a structural socialist party that looks to transform society in a utopian direction. And that utopian dynamic in Europe has been extremely destructive. In fact, you don't have that in the United States. You don't have it in Canada, although we have an NDP, we have a New Democratic Party, which is moderately socialist, or used to be. So the political dynamics are very different. Americans don't identify in the same way with the third world. There isn't that same kind of
Well, there's no guilt. I mean, there's no guilt. I mean, Europe has a lot of guilt about their former empires, and
America doesn't have an empire.
we're former colonies. We ourselves are former colonies, so.
The closest thing America came to having an empire was the Philippines, which was occupied by America, and then Americans committed to freeing the Philippines, which happened after World War II. That was it.
The Philippines is very, the Philippines is extremely close.
Somebody wants to say something.
Just a small thing to. This is my second time in Montreal, and my first time I was in May with another group, and it was happening during the rally. There was a rally, and I was doing the rally with the flag, and I saw the support in Israel, and it was such a good time to see the community so strong, and everybody loved Israel. And then after the war was in July, and now I come here, and since I come here, I always hear hatred, and because of what's happening tomorrow, and since we arrived, we all hear negative stuff and pessimistic stuff, and I'm hopeless. Like seriously, what I'm doing, it's so cool. I just met a Jewish girl before who is, again, she's the leader that boycotted.
Student.
Yeah, and she's Jewish, and I'm like, I can't believe it.
Yeah, there's a lot of Jews. There's a lot of Jews on campus that are very,
Such a big
very
university in
fiercely.
Canada.
Well, no, in all the universities where there's Jews, a lot of those Jews are involved in the anti-Israel. I'm telling you, this is they want to be left-wing more than they want to be Jews.
That is an old Jewish problem. There's nothing new about what you're talking about.
Yeah, so
nothing new about it.
My point is, why not put all the power in not fighting who hates us from outside, but fighting from inside?
Well, that's where you are today.
That's what we
This
try to
seminar,
do.
this seminar is called the Israel Learning Seminar. Brings together students precisely to educate them on the real issues, the truth of matters. And I'll tell you an interesting thing. We've been doing this Israel seminar here in Toronto. We're going to be doing it in Toronto as well. Doing it for 5 or 6 years now. And we noticed 3 years ago something really interesting. That almost half of the students who are attracted to this program, this program is on top of your studies, right? It's a kind of
Yeah.
informal course which you take but which you don't get credit for. Almost half of the people coming forward are non-Jews. And some of the best Zionists we have trained are non-Jewish.
I explained to them this whole issue with the non-Jews.
And I think we have to revise, and I've been talking to colleagues at other universities in the States and Canada, we're going to have a conference on this. I think we have to revise our assumption that the campus generally is anti-Israel. The well-organized groups on campus, some of them are anti-Israel, they make a lot of noise. And university administrations are cowardly, they don't intervene, but they're allowed to do outrageous anti-Semitic things, in part because they threaten violence. There's an implicit threat of violence. But that doesn't mean that the bulk of students in the universities are in any clear sense pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel. So I think we have to do much more work reaching out to the students and cultivating an intelligent, open, pro-Israel point of view. We encourage debate. Israel is not, really two shoes. Israel makes mistakes. Israel is a society. As Barbara said, Israel has one of the most vigorous democratic structures. People disagree on all kinds of things. Israel's a democracy. So we encourage that. But at the same time, the massive fact of Israel's achievement in her region, in her neighborhood, has to be told. And of course, the negatives, the bad things, including Israeli Hezbollah, which is awful, has to be dealt with.
And their own PRs, their own communications in general.
Just the way I wanted to what you just say. It's another issue, your impression, we discussed it today as well. It's very negative. I've told you there's a lot of positive stuff happening as well.
Yeah, I hope it's going to be more positive
That,
stuff.
but you see, there's another issue we can cross, which you should know, is the student unions, most of the campuses, are not very democratic. In other words, it's a minority of students, they're very active, and happen to be sometimes pro-Arab or on the left. They take over, and they pass resolutions. Sometimes even there's not a quorum necessary to pass a resolution. But they make a lot of noise. So you have a situation where the majority of the students are the silent majority. They're not involved. And very few are involved, very few are active. What you saw today in McGill, it's run by a small group. It makes a lot of noise. The problem is we don't have on our side students who are willing.
Where is our side?
And,
I didn't see any sign of
there are not
both.
enough of them. That's the thing. Some campuses have them. And I have some examples. We actually brought a gentleman here from, it was from Regina 2 years ago, who was involved in changing the dynamics on the campus and getting the BDS campaign out of the campus or defunded, as they say. And so it's kind of I would say it's more of an impression. There's a lot of negativity here and a lot of anti-Israel sentiment. But as you heard here tonight and throughout the day, it is not really the case if you start really scratching under the surface. You see, so we actually discussed the fact that we should explore to see what's going on in these unions and expose them for the lack of democracy.
One thing we deal with Jewish students on campus and pro-Israel students, and we say, get involved in the newspaper, the campus newspaper. Go to the newspaper, begin writing articles. It's very hard to get people to do this. But the pro-Palestinians learned years ago, that's one way to control opinion on campus. They do it. So what part of what you are saying, where are the Jewish students? And I'm going to say part of the answer to that observation. Where are the Jewish organizations to support those students? Where are the Hillels on campus? Where are the federations? There no longer is an active Canadian Zionist Federation. It sort of rolled over and died. So who's going to support the kids on campus? We try to do what we can do. But on the other hand, I just want to say it can be very distorting to only look at that small group that makes the noise and to conclude that the whole structure goes along with them or supports them or agrees with them. And that's why I think the polls show you that later in life, the pro-Israel portion remains steady. It's quite interesting.
I'm an exchange program in Israel now, and I meet a lot of Jewish students originally from Tibet and Israel, and they say that the pro-Palestinian organization are very organized. They have a lot of activities, but Hillel and all the Jewish organizations, they don't do. They do a lot of religion events.
They don't get involved politically.
Yeah, but they don't do any political thing. And I don't want to criticize, but it's not my job. But I think you cannot stay silent when you have to give, because they lie. I walked in the McGill University yesterday, 2 days ago, and I saw like Israeli soldiers rape they lie to the population.
No, you got it wrong, This is the best, and this came from Hebrew University, by the way. They say Israeli soldiers don't rape Palestinian women. Why? Because they're racist. I swear to God. Where did they get this idea from? Her name was Ayelet Tal, a sociology, her master's thesis for Hebrew University was the racism of the IDF because they don't rape Palestinian women. This was her idea. She got a prize from Hebrew University. In fact, one of the problems is that in these departments, in Israel's own universities, like Tel Aviv is more. Tel Aviv had an Israeli apartheid week.
Thank you.
I mean, they have it on their own campus. Israel.
Yeah, sure.
The founder of the boycott and sanction movement is a graduate, and I think it was at Hebrew University or Tel Aviv University, Omar Badru. That's right.
Yeah.
Which is the biggest irony ever.
Well, there's so much irony coming out.
Yeah, but I know I'm thinking about the average
You have to give a prize. Does a university have to give a prize to a thesis that says the IDF is racist because it refuses to rape Palestinian women? Is this disgusting as an idea, as a notion? And if they rape them, would that be, good. So you're just like you're just like all the other armies. That's excellent. Yeah, I mean.
There's a professor at Tel Aviv. What is his name? Published a book last year denying the existence of the Jewish people. There has never been a Jewish people.
Yes. That sounds right.
Now he has announced that he wishes to renounce his Judaism. He is ashamed of his Judaism.
What's to renounce? There's no Jewish people.
So, I mean.
Now, these are people that are seriously, they have pathological issues, personal issues, and they're working them out in this way. And because they're so passionate about their own self, they'll put the time into it, they put the energy into it because they have no other life.
But the word pathological that Barbara used.
On the other side, you lose your life.
That word is very
On
important.
the other side, you have no life, on the other side, you lose your life.
The word is important because a lot of the dynamics we face, particularly with Jewish students, who they have very little notion of what Judaism is. They come from secular families, usually left wing. They claim to be functionally what does it mean. A lot of that is an old phenomenon among Judaism, in the Jewish world, Jewish history, called Jewish self-hatred. Certain marginal Jews who prevented from joining larger society, larger groups because of anti-Semitism, turn the hatred against themselves, blame themselves, and psychologically. You see a lot? You see a lot? That's to be dealt with. There's an unconscious dimension to identity formation, identity dynamics. I don't know if any of you have read Freud, Civilization and Its Discontents. He was a Jewish guy. So it's well worth reading in terms of that kind of identity structure. He was writing in 1932 as the Nazis were writing. Who's speaking? Thank you all for coming here. Any Israeli students at Montreal universities, please connect with us. Please come over.
But you have to give us hope. Like, what can we do?
We hope we're giving you hope. We're here.
We're not, this was not a very hopeful
Yeah,
talk.
well,
I know that. You know what? Sometimes you have to face up to a situation that looks hopeless, and get anxious.
But
And
what can we do? Post on Facebook and
Guys, I got some other more good news, by the way, just so you know, I know this is boring, the good news. So the vote yes, so the, which is supporting the motion with the net Israel, has about 500 people, and the vote no has about 800.
what?
Yeah, so the vote no group is actually doing a lot better than the vote yes.
Well, okay.
You know, me and my friends have been working on the vote no group, and,
I had no idea there was
Ladies and gentlemen, they've got to move. I want to thank you very much, Barbara. And we'll see again Professor Krantz on Thursday in Concordia University.
האוטובוס למטה.
Thank you very much, and thank you for helping
חבר'ה, זבל גם כן תאספו.
אפשר לקחת את העיתונים ולשים עליו בשביל...
זבל יש פה בחוץ פח.
לא? זה היה בוא נשאל איזשהו שיודע. לא, אנחנו הולכים עכשיו לאיימקס. אתם באים איתנו? לא נכון.
Sorry?
באמת ישראל. כן. אחד זה בטעות אני אשכח.
זה היה מעניין.